Hi, and welcome to Work Together, a podcast brought to you by SocialOptic. SocialOptic offer tools and expertise, empowering organisations to gain critical insights, make informed decisions, and work together better. In this podcast series, we ask experts in their field for their views, thoughts, and advice on topics that we encounter with organisations and leaders, ranging from technology and data science to organisational culture and psychology. Roll intro. On today's episode, we'll be looking at the topic of organisational culture, strategy, and change. Joining Benjamin Ellis is Alison Minns, a culture specialist with over 10 years' experience. Alison discusses the importance of accountability for behaviour and the role of leaders in setting behavioural standards, the connection between culture and strategy, and the opportunities that a strong organisational culture can bring. Let's dive in.
I don't think you can be credible as a leader unless you are sort of role modelling and showcasing and setting the tone and the expectations for those behaviours yourself.
Welcome to the Work Together podcast. I am joined by Alison today. And Alison, I'm going to get you to introduce yourself for our listeners. So, because it's a kind of fascinating background you've got. So tell us who you are.
Thank you. Thanks, Benjamin. Lovely to be here today. Alison Minns. I most recently have been the global lead for culture at HSBC, and I was in that role for about 4 or 5 years. Prior to that, I was a consultant working with a number of different clients across a variety of sectors and industries, so pharma, manufacturing, some tech startups, helping them with culture challenges specifically, but also some change management work. Some of them were going through IPOs, some were going through mergers and acquisitions, some just had general employee communication and engagement challenges that they needed some support with from a culture angle specifically. But I really got into the world of culture with the job before that, which was at Lloyds Banking Group. I was there for 10 years. I did a variety of program management and change management roles in the expatriate banking business back in the days when they were international, pre-financial crisis, before moving into HR. So I made a sideways move after about 5 years of working in the sort of change space in that bank, and landed eventually, after a few sort of a variety of roles in HR, landed as one of the first culture roles that Lloyds Banking Group created on the back of the financial crisis and some of the PPI issues that were going on at the time. So that was way back in 2014. So I've been a culture specialist for 10 years now, and love it. Still my passion. Still the thing that I get excited about, and can only see more and more opportunities and or headlines with culture cropping up as time goes on, which is great for me to see.
Definitely does seem to be going that way. I'm going to tease you a bit now because oftentimes people bring the culture issues to HR to solve. In some ways, you literally brought the culture issue to HR by your career path. But there is that thing about, on the one side, who owns culture, and on the other side, some people who just say, "Oh, well, culture that's an HR issue." And what's your experience been? Who owns culture?
Yeah, it's not the first time I've been asked that question. I have to say, it's one that crops up quite a lot, and it crops up sometimes with the tone of, you can't surely expect this to be HR's thing to deal with. As sort of how could HR, from the inside voice of HR, how can we possibly deal with the whole culture of an organisation? But equally, on the flip side, it does need a home somewhere, usually within an organisation that's got a bit of structure anyway. So I do find quite often the home for culture work, culture change does sit within the HR function, and I think that's purely as a result of HR being the people experts, and I've certainly in my time being part of the HR function, I've seen changes go on where HR overall were viewed as you only do the operational stuff, and it's payroll and it's grievances and it's disciplinaries and that's about it. And now actually I think HR are trying to come out the other side with some real strategic business partnering. And I think culture does fit into that category. However, I think if we get into a little bit more detail, if I'm allowed to at this point, this early point in the session,
we'll let you.
Yeah, good, great, thank you. It is a bit more complicated than that, and I think there's a variety of levels of accountability around culture. And one of the ways I think about it is culture is essentially the output of how collectively people are behaving inside a business or an organisation. So if we're talking about people's behaviour, then I very firmly believe, both professionally and personally, that everyone is accountable for their own behaviour. So you can never outsource, whether you are the CEO, C-suite leader, HR, head of finance, CFO, it doesn't matter. But your behaviour is your behaviour and you're accountable for it. And obviously the further up you travel through a hierarchy in an organisation or into a position of power, even if it's a fairly flat hierarchy, your influence and the influence you have over others and their careers expands. So then no longer are you just accountable for your behaviour, but you've also got to be role modelling and setting some standards, behavioural standards for others as well. And I think that needs to be visible. And I think you need to help people with not only saying what you'd like to happen behaviourally, we should be behaving like this. And that might be through something official like some values, or it might just be what you're saying in other forums and formats. So I think you've got to help people by also acting in line with that. And I've got countless examples, some of which I probably wouldn't be able to go into, but where leaders don't walk the talk, and the challenges that gives employees, the dissonance that causes them, is really difficult. I don't think you can be credible as a leader unless you are sort of role modelling and showcasing and setting the tone and expectations for those behaviours yourself. Couple of other points, I think, in why the business leaders specifically, whether it's a CEO or perhaps at the level under that, need to think very carefully about culture and the role they want to be playing in it. One is they usually have set the strategy at a certain level, up, whether it's the CEO themselves or the executive committee or whatever. The culture and culture change, if you want to change anything about the culture of the organisation, must be anchored in whatever the business is trying to do. Because otherwise culture just ends up, and I see this a lot as well, it just ends up being some extra thing that's left floating out, not really plugged into anything in the organisation. Because it's very complex, it's probably the most complex thing out there, because we're talking about lots of people's behaviours, and most people don't even understand why they behave as individuals in the way they do, let alone how we all behave collectively. So it's a complex, nuanced topic. That means if you believe it should be there to accelerate your strategy, which I do believe, and it's anchored in helping you achieve your strategy. A great healthy culture of high performance should be helping you achieve whatever your business is there to do. And equally, if you're not focusing on your culture and some issues crop up, and hopefully it wouldn't ever turn into a toxic culture, but that does happen, that will clearly be detracting from you achieving your strategy. So why you would then want to sort of devolve responsibility for that, or the work that goes into that, or any of the other bits and pieces, the expertise that goes into that, to a function that already has a whole load of super important, mission critical jobs as part of it. I'm not sure. So I think leaders have got a crucial role to be playing. I think everybody has a role in terms of everybody's accountable for their own behaviour, but HR are the people experts typically in an organisation. So actually, if it needs a home, then HR can be the ones sort of holding up the mirror, setting some standards, being the experts around it. But that isn't always the case. I think the one thing I've learned about culture is there's no hard and fast with it.
I was talking to a VC recently who, in the somewhat dry tone that VCs can sometimes adopt, said, culture in early stage companies is a CEO problem. said, because they're usually the one that's caused the culture problem,
Yeah.
which was harsh. But I think for people who've worked with early stage companies, they may recognise some aspects of that, and that what gets modelled is what happens. I think it's interesting in the shift of who is accountable for culture, because increasingly that is becoming a board level issue in a way that perhaps it wasn't before, either at particular inflection points in the business, in terms of things around mergers and acquisitions, but also in terms of compliance risk, essentially risk to the business, and looking at the board's responsibility for that. Boards seem to be a lot more interested now in that than they were before. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. And certainly some of the companies I've worked in being regulated, the question, not just the UK financial services regulators, but I know the New York Fed, I know APRA in Australia, I know there's quite a few, MAS in Singapore, HKMA for Hong Kong. I know a lot of regulatory scrutiny is increasing. If I'm honest, and I'm sometimes a little bit controversial in my views and opinions, but if I'm honest, it's been on the regulator's radar from financial services point of view anyway, since the financial crisis in 2008. That's a long time ago. And I'm a little bit surprised we're still sort of seeing some of the stories that hit the headlines that we do. So I think what I take from that is that no one has cracked culture, whether it's accountability for culture, whether it's measurement for culture, whether it's any of these, even dare I say it, a definition for culture and especially organisational culture. So, I think that just goes to support the point that I was making earlier about how complicated and complex it is as a topic, specifically in terms of that board level discussion. So I tend to see leaders and boards looking at culture from one of two angles, and there probably are some others, but the main two angles I see are either we need to mitigate risk. So looking after our culture is a risk mitigation exercise. On the other side, and perhaps this is more, perhaps the less regulated organisations or some of those, early startups or scale-ups, where actually culture is a massive opportunity. We've got an amazing culture, and I see some of the organisations with the VCs you were talking about. I actually see on the positive side to that, some of the CEO founders, bring their own flavour of a culture completely with them, because this is their thing. They're so passionate about it, and that visionary element really brings people with them. And if people buy into that vision, then you've quite often got an amazing culture. But then sometimes it can go a bit off course, for various reasons, different reasons, perhaps in the more regulated industries. So I think, yes, the conversation is elevating. I'm really pleased to see that. I think the role of boards in particular is in part to help keep the management committees on track, and hold them accountable a little bit. So if I talk a little bit in levels perhaps of accountability, I think the boards are accountable for in some ways sort of setting a bit of a direction around the purpose of an organisation. So in my opinion, they should be involved in helping shape and set that, along with a lot of other people. That isn't just for the board, but I think ultimately the board needs to be clear on why a company exists. The management committee and a couple of levels below that, actually, though, I think the leaders, if I use that term collectively, are accountable for the culture. And what I mean by that is creating the environment in which their teams operate. And they need to be really aware of that. And I get that that's a really big statement. And I get it's quite scary, actually, for people new into leadership roles. But in that position, then I think the easiest suggestion, to put to people is get out there and ask people what it feels like to work here, especially if you've not come up through the ranks of that organisation yourself. So that might not be obviously anymore going into the physical presence of the company, depending on the nature of the organisation, but just scheduling some time with some random people in different functions, different levels. Just ask them, what's it feel like to work here? And then listening. And that's the important bit. Asking the questions, the easy bit, but not then overriding with, I think this, I see that. Just listening to how it feels to work here, so that you can start to form a view, and you can decide whether that's in line with what you're there to do as that leader of that particular part of the business, or as the CEO. So I think the CEO and leadership, however that's defined, is ultimately accountable for the culture, in that it's creating the environment. And then, as I said before, everybody's got a responsibility for their own behaviour. So yeah, boards and those exec committees, accountability. I think this is slightly negative, perhaps future predicting of me, but I think as people get more interested in culture, and they get more interested in it not just from protecting companies from a risk and protecting them against the headlines, they're more interested in terms of ESG point of view as well. So they're wanting to attract both investment from investors and people into an organisation. And the culture now, I think there's a general level of acceptance that what an organisation is like, what it feels like, is a really important driver for that.
Oh, so many things I want to come back to in there, because that touches on the issue of what I call performance cultures, which is a real thing at the moment, of wanting to make a culture appear a certain way, which is what a lot of people do. But the lived culture is quite different, and that disconnect can be massively problematic for organisations. Thinking of a few that I've come across recently, where they hired loads of people into this espoused value, but the inside of the company actually wasn't that at all. And unsurprisingly, all of those people left, and it was a massive wasted investment in trying to bring them on. But coming back further than that to that board piece of it, I remember in the 90s working with Cisco Systems, I was involved in a lot of the acquisitions and looking at companies and deciding whether that was a fit. And it was interesting that one of the rules or tests that Cisco had was actually looking at cultural fit. And that, I think, was pretty unprecedented at the time. And in fact, still to some degree is something that a lot of organizations don't look at. They're like, we'll buy them and we'll fix the culture. Good luck with that.
Yes.
But actually, that was one of the things, was going around talking to the people, listening and thinking, how will our team interact with their team? Are there shared values? Are there shared behaviors? Or is this actually just going to turn into a dogfight on the ground at the point of acquisition, in which case we're not going to get the value for it? So it was interesting that was very much a board level view on cultural fit was a go, no go for acquisitions. And I think that's really only just coming back now, isn't it, in terms of people starting to make that a test for, do we acquire this organization or not?
Yeah, and actually, it's interesting. It's something I've been looking into recently because of the rise of transformational deals, the sort of inorganic growth that's happening at the moment. And I've got a little bit of background in working on mergers and acquisitions, in particular in culture, almost due diligence. And I think one observation generally is quite often the people stuff is left a little bit to the end. It's almost we'll go into a closed room and figure out the really complicated financial bit of the deal. It's viable. We'll get to the next stage, and then it's almost a now what do we do with the people thing. So if I had one ask of anybody listening who's going through this at the moment, it would be to bring your people experts in, either from the external deal team or whoever can be involved in-house early, because it's so complicated. so one when I was sort of going back through all my my work on that, there was a couple of stats that stuck out to me that are bang up to date actually, and one of them was so when I looked up what the global value of deals was in 2022, it's $3.8 trillion.
Wow!
So that's pretty that's a big amount of money. And then I knew there was some stats around how important culture is to the make or break of a deal. And I think this came from PwC actually, in one of their surveys, merger and acquisition surveys. They found that 65% of acquirers say cultural issues hampered the creation of value in their deal. So 65% of acquirers, now that's not a dollar amount, but if 65% of those deals have the value creation, and the total value creation last year being 3.8 trillion, being hampered because of cultural issues, to me, the mind boggles as to why we need to be bringing this to the table a lot earlier and talking about it and figuring it out. And as I said earlier, there are no easy answers to this. I'm not saying, and then follow this process or do these steps, or deploy this platform, this tool or whatever, and magically, those cultural issues will be resolved. They probably won't. But what it does require is some of those expert brains, that brain power around the table to start thinking about, okay, if we've got two very different cultures here that are coming together, what do we need to protect from that? Because it's part of that deal value, and what can we let go, and that's okay, because actually there'll be some cost realization or whatever, and people may well leave, and it's all, but it's just protecting. We need to keep some of these people to realize the value. I think it's absolutely crucial for anyone going through inorganic growth at the moment.
It's interesting. I think mismatched cultures are the best demonstration of the power and impact of culture from an organizational risk point of view, in that, and again, there's different approaches to this, but if you think about how a company operates at different levels, so taking your earlier conversation and turning it upside down and starting from what the individual does, what the team does, how people at a team level manage contention between resources and how they do things, the processes, but then to how the processes get created and how things get fixed when things go outside of the process. And as you start to get into that outer level, that's your catastrophic risk to the business. And that is actually a culture issue. And again, to mismatch cultures, if you've got one culture that had a particular lever for enforcing we do the right thing here, around how they decide actually this process is wrong because whatever the reason is, we're going to go fix it, to then introduce a culture that has a different lever. Sometimes you can end up with no lever on, well, that's broken and I know, but I don't think that's my job to fix that anymore. Or I don't think I can do that. Or I think if I speak out about that, I'm going to lose my position. And when you get to that point, which is definitely cultural failure, that's where you get your big systemic failures of the kind of things that we've seen in the last few years. And that is culture, because it's that outer ring where people decide what's important and whether they can do something about it or not.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And actually, it's a nice term to be using, lever, I think, because it's something, the approach that I take when I get involved in a piece of culture work is culture as a word means so many things to different people. And we can all debate the definition of culture, and we come up with an academic view, and we can come up with a, anthropologist view, and we can come up with, we've all got our preferred definition. When I get presented with an organisation or a part of an organisation that has a culture challenge, normally that culture challenge, that the issue might present as we've got a toxic culture, or this went wrong and it's a cultural problem. When I drill down into it and you get to the next level below culture as the umbrella term, there's usually 5, 6, 7 things underneath that actually almost, so far in my experience, almost everything boils down to one or a combination of these things. And these are big things in and of themselves. So one of them you've mentioned, where it might be the processes are fundamentally different. And we see that a lot. Companies that are going through digitization at the moment, and we've all been going on that journey for a long time, but there's still a long way to go. Where you've got a more traditional set of products or services, or whatever it is the organization provides, but there's also bringing that together with the how do we digitize. There's quite often naturally a clash there in the processes. But there can also be a clash some of the other areas. So that's one lever, processes, I find that needs to be looked at underneath the umbrella term of culture. But then there's some other ones, and I think one of the biggest is leadership behavior. So people perhaps underestimating the influence that a leader has. And if we just touch briefly back again onto the mergers and acquisitions, where you have one particular leadership style in one organisation and a very different one in another, that causes problems unless it's managed very carefully. And the management of that very carefully, it's quite often working really closely with your senior communications folk to understand how you message some of these things. And again, just to give a little bit of a small example to bring things to life. But when I've worked on a merger and acquisition in the past, there was a sense from the deal team, we can't go out with anything, we can't go out with anything, we can't go out with anything. Super top secret, whatever. Absolutely, all of the details of the deal are completely not allowed to be released. But at a certain point in the transaction, some details are able to, you're allowed to announce that the deal's happening, and there's various stages of that. At certain points then in those communications, I would strongly advise that whatever you can say about perhaps the leadership style of whether it's a new organisation that's being formed or one's being subsumed by another should be said, because people will join the dots for themselves in those organisations, and they'll probably join them incorrectly. So nature abhors a vacuum. They will make up their own views on what's going to happen, and it will probably be 10 times worse than what is actually going to happen. And they may well start to vote with their feet. Now, some people you might be okay with that, but others you're like, gosh, that's our top talent walking out the door, possibly with all of our clients. So there's some small bits and pieces that can be done quite early on in those processes, but it doesn't just apply to M&A and deals. Even in the normal course of what I think of as almost a culture review trigger point. So the trigger point might be a change in leadership. Either the CEO or a chairman or chairperson, or one of the other senior leaders might be moving on, and you've got a new person coming in. Have a look and what's their style? What might that do to the culture? What are their views on culture? What do they want to bring? How front and center is it of their mind, or is it not at all? Are they more, it just happens organically? So that might be one inflection point or trigger point that comes in. Change of strategy. You've got the same leaders, but you need to pivot and do something differently. That should also be a point to start thinking about and looking at your culture. A massive global event. So that might not be in your control. In fact, it probably isn't in your control, but actually a massive pandemic or a war, or any of the things that are facing us at the moment. Start to have a look and think about how might this be impacting our people's behavior, and look at that. So there's a number of triggers, I would say, that should be points where they're natural points where it goes, okay, let's think about culture here. And then you can start to look at some of these levers. So we talked a little bit about processes. We've talked a bit about leadership behaviour. Is your strategy clear? This again, I'm always a little bit surprised, actually, and I only say this because I worked in strategy for a while before moving into HR. But some businesses the strategy might be clear in somebody's head somewhere, but it's certainly not clear to the rest of the organisation. Is that clear? Because if that isn't clear, you can think that's not a cultural problem. That's they need to be clear on their strategy and communicate it. That's just that. But actually, if you're not clear on your strategy and you haven't communicated it, people don't know what role they play. So how do they know what their part is in the organisation? And an equal counterpoint to being clear and communicating well and getting people to engage with the business strategy is, have you got a nice, clear, well communicated and engaged with purpose and or vision and a set of values? And I know values are controversial. Lots of people sort of roll their eyes and go, oh, that's it's a mouse mat and it's some words on a poster on a wall or in a lobby somewhere. That's all values are. It's like, well, yeah, that is what values are when they're done badly. When they're done well, is people should resonate with the people in your organisation, so that not only do they know what they're doing, because they're clear on the strategy, but they know how they're going to go about doing it, and it's inspiring to them. I'm not saying everybody works for a company where it's creating world peace and some higher goals and aims that chime in beautifully with your personal values, but at least think, actually, I get what this company does, and I like how they do it. So that works for me.
It's interesting, that aspect of culture and transitions. And again, I think it's very easy sometimes people to maybe listen and go, oh, well, I'm not going to do mergers and acquisitions, so I don't have that problem. So I think it's a good point to make, that actually the transition of a leader, a change in strategy, can be just as significant an event. But also there's something in the way that changing circumstances, either for the leadership team or for the organisation, it almost moves the ball on the pitch, is the only way I can think to describe it, where suddenly you start exercising a bit of the culture that was always there, but perhaps not visible before. And again, one of the sort of more nuanced ways to think about culture is in terms of those values and principles that people use. And it may be that there were certain trade-offs that they didn't have to exercise before. And suddenly when you move into a different phase where it's like, oh, actually, this is about cost control, where suddenly you get different dynamics around, well, does that mean that we shortchange the customer? Does that mean that we shortchange ourselves? How are we going to make that happen? Where you can suddenly expose either things where the culture was not aligned, even though it seemed like it was before, or where the culture is not as stable in terms of having an appropriate set of values that are functional for the business. And so organizations that can seem perfectly healthy suddenly end up very quickly dysfunctional, just because that ball's got moved in terms of what they've got to exercise because the external circumstances have changed. Or conversely, you get a really dysfunctional organization, and we saw this a lot during COVID, where you'd rate an organization as not necessarily highly performant in terms of the culture, that suddenly when the ball got moved to this survival quadrant, they did that phenomenally well. They knew how to do that, and they could create change and do a whole set of things which previously weren't possible because they got moved away from the value conflicts that they inherently had as an organization, to suddenly realizing, oh, we're one team, we've got a set of aligned goals here.
Yes, makes me think two things. One is about culture and culture change specifically. Culture just exists anyway, right? Every company has a culture, whether you choose to shape it as a leader or not. But if you want to change the culture, it really helps to have a burning platform. And I always wince saying that, because that usually means not a very nice thing is happening. But COVID-19 is a great example of that. That has changed a lot of things for a lot of organisations for good and in some cases for bad. Reputational damage, hitting the headlines. No one wants that. It's terrible. But if you kind of hit rock bottom, or not far off rock bottom, then actually there's it becomes really clear that you've got some fundamental things to sort out, and they may or may not be cultural things. But if they are, that actually focuses the mind and the attention on what needs doing. So that struck me as you were speaking, that it's almost easier in a lot of ways when you're in a bit of a negative space sometimes around culture. But it also made me think when you said what some of the companies are doing well, particularly when some of the other operational or perhaps day-to-day operational things were whipped away, as they were for lots of people during the pandemic, and it just was hunker down and get into survival mode. One of the things I think that I've seen work really well is ethical dilemma training, or exercises. Training's too strong a word. I'm not a big believer in you can just train a culture in particularly. But what those are they get at the nitty-gritty. I think in most instances, people know, the obvious, this is legal, this is illegal. And even to a lesser extent, this is what the policy says we have to do, and this is what we're not allowed to do from the policy point of view. So taking it one step removed from legality. Where culture gets really tricky is in just almost the personal preferences. When a customer comes in and says this, I'd say this. And someone goes, oh, gosh, I would absolutely never say that. What I would say is this. And you get into those kind of conversations. Now, some of those, I think, are great just for people to be having that thrashed out as a team, and just go, what do we want to stand for? When this kind of thing comes up, this grey area where there's no clear, hard and fast right and wrong, what do we want to stand for as a team? And that then probably, and that's another dynamic we haven't really touched on yet. We've talked about individuals and leaders and C-suite and boards, but team dynamics for culture is super important. Because then you take it away from an individual point of view, which culture isn't. It can't be by definition. It's always collective. And you then are setting what you stand for as a collective. And hopefully the leader of the team is able to then shape that where you reach a deadlock. But the idea there being, we've all now bought into this. We've thrashed it out. I can see both sides of the coin, of the arguments. And actually we've agreed, our team are going to approach things like this, where there is no hard or fast rule. That's really empowering. It's really mature. It's really adult to adult, because the other quite standard cultural problem I see is where cultures become quite parent-child. I'm bringing a bit of, sort of pop psychology into this, but where we're either the paternal, the maternal. We provide for you. You do what we say, and then you're removing agency from people. And some people like that, and they think, yeah, great, okay, you just tell us what to do. But then you get inefficiencies and a lack of productivity and a lack of imagination and a lack of creativity and a whole load of things that causes. Or some people rail against it and go, no, I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. And you get some slightly destructive behaviours, perhaps, from railing against that parent-child. So trying to move the conversation onto some of these difficult behavioural choices so that they are genuine, mature, adult-to-adult conversations, I think is probably a good starting point.
And the empowering nature of a good culture. I always sort of memorable career moments for me. I was working for Juniper Networks, and Scott Krenz was the CEO at the time, and a very successful previous business to Juniper. And we were talking about various bits of strategy and things that needed doing. And I was really, I guess, as somebody earlier in my career, fumbling around for, what things am I allowed to do, and what do I have to come back and ask and talk to other people. And he said to me, Benjamin, these are our values as a company, and went through them. And they were pretty rich values, because it wasn't just the one word. Actually, each one had a statement which really clarified what the behavioural output of that value was. So these are our values, and this is how we do things. And if you do something and it's in line with those values, you're never going to be in trouble. If you do something that's out of line with these values, we're going to have a very stern conversation. But if it's in line with those values, that's the right thing to do. Go and do it and clear the way. And it was an interesting thing that, particularly in environments where you have to make decisions quickly and you don't have the time to get everybody aligned, which was very much the case at that point in the company's growth. Actually, that culture, a strong culture, a well-espoused culture, becomes a really good shortcut to sound decision making and getting people aligned, that otherwise can lead to a lot of procrastination and going around in circles, which I've watched happen at bigger companies later on in my career, where there just wasn't that set of values where people could align, and it just ended up in fights between different divisions around which product was and wasn't going to go ahead.
Yeah, I love that example. I think you've given a really great illustration of what values can do when they're done well, and that is absolutely act as a heuristic for how do we behave in this situation. So, just that shortcut of, gosh, I've got to act quickly. What do I do? If a company or a leader is coming out and saying, whatever you do, as long as you're behaving in line with our values, because we are so bought into those values, and we believe in them, that actually you can do no wrong as long as you're able to justify, you've said I did it because of it fits in with X, Y, Z, and we can see that. I think that's fantastic. That's exactly as they should be being used, and that's the opposite of the values as a mouse mat and a whatever else. If people are actually sort of putting almost really moving performance management into becoming completely values aligned. You're almost saying this is how we look at how our people are performing from a behaviours point of view, not necessarily what they're delivering from a widgets or whatever they actually produce, but from a behaviours point of view, that's best practice, I'd almost say.
Well, it's interesting, and I'm going to pull you back to an earlier question now, because interestingly at Juniper, at least at that point in time, the performance evaluation of employees was actually done partially on value alignment, which is fascinating and not something I've ever seen anywhere else. But there was a performance aspect of it, and there was a values aspect of it. And you could be a best performer, but if you weren't exhibiting the company values, then that was not going to be a positive performance review for you. Conversely, if you were at the weaker end of performance, but were very strong on the values, it was very much around how do we address these performance issues and get you up and out of this. If you're in the bottom of those two things, then that was a whole different conversation. But it was interesting that was baked in, which brings me round to, so if culture is so important, how do you measure it?
Yeah. Great question. Long-standing question that I don't think anyone has answered in the 10 years, in a nice, neat way anyway. But it's given me, I've had 10 years to think about the answer to this question. So
exactly.
it's been a long time coming. Yeah. Yes. So what do I think? I'm really conflicted about this question. On one hand, I firmly believe there are things about, and this is a really timely question with things like the rise of ChatGPT and OpenAI and some of the technology that's coming along, because without going too far down a philosophical route, because there is a danger of sliding down that rabbit hole. But the questions it makes me ask is, what is it to be human? So what is it that we're retaining as the processing power and the big data that's being pulled into these things increases and kind of overtakes us and our brains? What have we still got to offer, almost? And the answer to that, I think, is some of the things that make me rail against measuring culture. So imagination, creativity, ambition, motivation, bravery, some of those things. Does me having a score of 26 on imagination versus yours, Benjamin, of 76, what does that mean, and what's it going to be used for? And I kind of feel a bit the same about trying to put numbers and metrics to an organisation's culture. I believe, and it won't be the first time you've heard this, I decided this a long time ago, that an organisation's culture to me is a bit like an individual's personality. And I don't want to be told I'm 26 on the creativity front and I should be 52. It's kind of annoying, but it's also kind of irrelevant. It's all completely subjective. So there's one part of me that feels very strongly about that, and that there's just some things you cannot categorize, you just have to feel. And we've all felt when there's a good culture. Can we put a number to it or a metric to it, or can we look at the data as to why that is? Probably not. And that's also backed up by when we do sometimes look at the data that's available. Quite often it's a survey for culture. Even when we do have some of that data available, it doesn't always match up with what we're hearing or feeling people saying on the ground. So an engagement survey may say we're all scoring 76 engagement, but actually you walk around the office or the branch or the factory or whatever it is, or ask people online, and they're like, yeah, it doesn't feel that great at the moment, to be honest. Now that could be a challenge with the survey design. It could be a question, at a point in time. It could be all sorts of stuff. But what I do believe is we need to put the time and effort and thinking into a more holistic way of looking at the various data sources we do have, or that are shortly coming online or coming online now-ish, to put together a whole picture on what that's telling us about a culture. And what I would strongly advocate for anyone looking at this at the moment is base that on whatever the behavioural outcomes are that you're wanting. So I wouldn't do it for just doing its sake. It takes a lot of time and effort and energy and money and resources for to produce something, whether that's through a snazzy Power BI dashboard or anything else, any other tool or platform that you've got. People tend to look at it fairly briefly. Some people get quite impressed by some of the nice visualizations you can get and go, oh, that's great. But it may well shunt them off down a rabbit hole of chasing action and activity when it hasn't presented a more broader picture of what the culture actually is. So rather than just going, what's our culture like? I would advocate thinking about what's the behavior change that you're looking for. So what's not working right now? Ideally, what's not working right now that's preventing us from achieving our full potential, our strategy, whatever that might be, our business results. Put that into behavioural terms. What's it about? Is it about people aren't being accountable for their work, or people aren't being inclusive, or however you want to phrase it? Put it into behavioural terms. Then look at the data that you've got already. Don't necessarily go out and invent anything new or buy something new, but just see what you've got. How is that showing up? Is it showing up in attrition? Is it showing up in performance reviews? Is it showing up in survey data? You can use survey data. What sources of data have you got that indicate whether, that's true or false, that statement? Then think about if you need to supplement that with something and go, okay, well, we've got a survey, ask some very generic high-level questions about inclusivity, but we don't really get at what we think the issue is here, which is this. You might then need to build something else out. And then take it from there, and then keep the humble mindset that there is culture is never done. There's never a solution to it, and there shouldn't be. It's like having a solution to somebody's personality. It doesn't work like that. So think about what nudges and experiments and action you might want to take. Do them, record the results, change it if it's not working, do something different, and keep on that humble. None of us have the right answer here. But what else can we try? But ground it in your strategy, ground it in what behavioural outcomes you want, use what data you've already got available, then supplement that with extra stuff, and then keep testing and experimenting the interventions and actions that you're putting in place on the back of it, I would say.
It's interesting. I think almost every single kind of all hands survey that I've seen has been an exercise in very poor design when it comes to measuring culture, because usually actually they're not designed to measure culture. Oftentimes there are normative assessments. It's like, are we the best place to work? It's like, that's a topic for a whole other podcast on that one. But moving aside from that, oftentimes they're not asking about culture. And you made an interesting point that culture is how people behave together, and yet a lot of times people design those question sets to ask very individual questions, and that's valid and useful, but that's not going to tell you about culture, and it's not going to tell you about how people do things here. So for us in designing questions, it's really getting to, well, what behaviors do you see, and how do you feel about those, and how that expresses itself at different points in the organization. How does that work at a team level? How does that work in your perspective, the leadership? And you can really then start to get under the lid of what's happening here and where have we got inconsistencies. And again, oftentimes people look at the data like a performance score. It's like, how fast did they run the 100 meters? And when we have to spend a lot of time dragging people out of, it's not about whether you got an 81 or an 82. It's really, what's the balance here on what people are experiencing, and where is that relative to where you want it to be? Okay, you're trying to be more innovative. Let's look at the aspects around how open people are to new ideas, how new ideas are received. That's the lever you probably want to pull. And again, it's not about whether you get 84 or 85 on that. It's about, okay, can we do something that moves the dial on that, because that's what we've identified that we need to move? Or maybe actually you discover in doing that, oh, actually everyone's really open to new ideas. We've got a different bottleneck here for driving innovation in the organization. So it's asking questions to get you to new questions, which again, a lot of the time what people roll out again and again and again, and the same questions every year are not anchored in the culture and not anchored in behavior and not anchored in levers that you can actually change. Which does bring me back to what you said there, which is, well, what are the levers that you have as a leadership team? Because everyone says, oh, changing culture is really, really hard, and then walks away at that point. So, are there a finite set of levers, or where do you go if you've got a culture issue and you want to start driving change?
Yes, I believe there are. I don't believe it's too big to do anything about. I kind of think when I think back, and again, I say this just from having, early part or most of my career actually in financial services, how much time and effort and thought has gone into risk management. I would love to see that same field and industry and resource and brain power built up around culture and behavior change, because I don't think they're that dissimilar. They're both incredibly intangible. We don't we can't really ascribe actually numbers to them. You can put some sort of metrics in place, but it's very, very difficult. And yet we seem to have managed to do it for risk. We haven't for culture. So I do believe there are some levers that are available. So regardless of, how we get to measuring it, I think as long as the principles of focusing on what outcomes you're looking for. So it's almost starting with the outcomes, but then working back from that, you've established what you want to see. Then some of the things you've got available to you. So I've mentioned some of them already, really. You do need a clear, well-communicated business strategy. I know that sounds like business 101, but that will impact. If you've got a strategy of growth, or even if it's a strategy and times are tough and you're looking for some efficiencies somewhere, just being open about that and people will see the authenticness of it and that will help the culture as well. So you've got strategy, that's sort of not once and done, but you don't need to spend hours agonizing over that bit for culture necessarily. Same with your purpose or mission or vision, but I definitely think a clear set of values that lots of people have bought into. They've not just been dropped on from a great height from the top down, and actually translating those clearly into behaviours. I think it is something an organisation needs to have in place so that you can do things like align some of your people processes to those. So your performance management, as we talked about, or hiring, some of your learning and development activity. The other thing you can do when you've got that is if you're an organisation that has lots of third parties, your values should also really be appearing in your contracts that you're signing up to with others. This is what we believe in. We hope we've got some similarities here. Then there's leadership behaviour. So there's a whole load of things, as we know, that can be done about leadership behaviour, but that probably sits within the sort of learning and leadership development space. But the final sort of tranche of levers, I would say, are almost a much more sort of operational kind of day-to-day things that are all massive buckets. I'm not going to make any apologies for these levers being huge in and of themselves. They're sort of one lever with lots of mini levers underneath them, or one cog with a whole lot of other cogs, if we're using a machine analogy. So they include things like processes, systems, governance. What have you got in place, if anything? How long does it take to make a decision across the organisation? How efficient are your processes in terms of getting you the results that you're wanting from a business point of view? All of that. People start to game systems. If they're feeling like things are laborious and clunky and they can't see the point in them, they'll start to find their own workarounds to them, or just not do them, or do them really apathetically. They just won't use them. And that is why, when you think of big tech programs, they quite often, if they don't get the return on investment they were predicting, it's quite often because the uptake hasn't been on day one. Everybody was using this tech in the way that it's meant to be used. It's like, no, because we don't see the point of it and we like the old way and all of that stuff. So you've got that whole tranche of operational stuff. The internal environment. So think about, and this is where it all plays into the remote working and hybrids, think about where people are actually physically sat. And that's not me coming out with they should be sat here and they should be in the office 2 days a week. It's not that. It's just going, there will be an impact on if you're walking into an office versus you're sat at home versus you're sat in a cafe versus you're in a branch versus you're in a factory somewhere. That will physically feel different, and you will operationally be different in the team that you work in because of that. So how do people collaborate? How do you build social cohesion across that? And then the final bit of capacity and capability. So have you got the right amount of people to be delivering what you need to? Too many, and people are like, well, I can put my feet up a little bit and the productivity probably goes down. Too few, and everybody knows what that feels like. It's an awful place to be, and lots of people are in that position at the moment. But the skills, so capacity and capability being things like, think about the human skills that may or may not exist at the moment in your employee base, and that is how are people able to relate to each other, to connect? How is the inclusion across the organisations, diversity of thought? How is people feeling like they can speak up and step out of the norm? Because that encourages creativity and innovation. So there's a whole load of skills in there that are not your hard skills, they're the human skills, but actually all of those things are things leaders can start to think about. Actually, this is the one lever that we really need to double down on, because actually we won't get the behavioural outcomes we need, because we know. And I think, if I'm honest, most organisations that have run, any kind of data gathering or surveys for some period of time will, in their heart of hearts, know probably the main one or two things they need to be focusing on, really, if they're very honest with themselves and go, actually, it's because of this, we're too bureaucratic, or we're too competitive with each other, or it's these things, and get to work on that, and that's it.
See, whatever the problem, there is a lever, and it's interesting that quite often people do know, but sometimes it takes that call it map, giving you the data to get people to the point of going, yeah, actually, we do all know that this is an issue. This is something that we're going to change, and we can commit to making that change. Seeing as you dragged AI into it, there's an interesting tale I was reading this week. There's a lot in the AI world around kind of goal-directed behavior and getting AI to achieve things, and it's interesting that a lot of the approach that historically had been, and again potentially driven by the fact that a lot of early AI was built for doing things like winning chess games. So it would try and play out every possible move to work out the best move forward, and that was very much the approach. And one of the things that's changed in the last few years is to go backwards and say, this is the goal, find all the possible paths back from the goal back to where we are now. So we could have saved them several years of research, just go and grab a Cavy book and begin with the end in mind. But it is interesting that even in the AI world, it's that thing of like, work out where it is that you want to get to and identify the barriers on the way to that. And then you're off to the races, because there will be a lever you can pull. There will be an intervention, and it might be a personal behavioural change for the leadership team. It might be something structural. It could be many things, but that one thing can be the thing that unlocks change, because whilst cultures are relatively static and relatively resistant to change, they do and can and will change over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Just as we're all humans and grow and change over time, so will an organisational culture. That and that is also another good reason for those triggers. Actually, an event happens, and actually that might then be the point of going, actually let's dig into the culture a little bit here. We've got a new CEO, or we've got a change in strategy, or something else has happened. This is our chance to face into actually what we think we know what our real problem is. It's this, and that is the chance to go, okay, we've had an amnesty now, the doors are open. That's the thing really we need to go after fixing. And until we fix that, we're not going to get culture change. What you can get, and just to throw this in, because I'm sure coming to the end of our time, but one thing I do see a lot of, lots of things get badged up as culture change, and I would argue they're probably not culture change. That's not to say they're not going to have some great behavioural changes. So a few years back, unconscious bias training was a thing. Probably still is in some places. That is amazing. Do that, and hopefully some light bulbs will go on in quite a few people's minds as to what having unconscious bias can lead to, and trying to mitigate for that, and all of those things. So definitely do that. Will you necessarily get the culture change or a culture change that you're wanting just through doing unconscious bias training? Probably not. And I think particularly when you see some of the reports that come out, I've got friends that work in the National Health Trusts doing work with Speak Up, but also now they're diversifying that across to the police force, to the fire service, and there's a whole load of interventions. People seem to like to go straight to either the metrics or the intervention. So they'll say, Alison, tell me what data you've got on culture. What metrics can we use for culture? Or they'll say, what action can we take to change our culture? And they might even be a bit more specific. We want a customer-focused culture. What action can we take? We need to start with what's the actual outcome and goal, as we're talking about. Start there, and then we can come on to metrics, and then we can come on to what interventions might change some of those metrics. But don't go necessarily for the big, bright, shiny thing and expect, the amount of times that I can see that they'll do the big, bright, shiny
culture program change and, sort of send every leader, 500 leaders to a really expensive training program, and then expect at the end of it the culture of the organisation to change. And it might do very, very, very slowly, but at the same time as that's changing slowly, as leaders are digesting and putting into practice some of this stuff, so is the external environment, so is the strategy, so are those leaders leaving and new ones are coming in. So actually, think about the outcome that you're wanting and target that, rather than just general culture change, or because it's a buzzword, or because we've seen everybody else do this amazing thing and everyone's raving about it. I mean, do that because they're raving about it and you want to do it, but don't necessarily expect the culture change off the back of it that you're wanting.
Yeah, and it is, people often rush to trying to adjust the output measure, which makes all of the wrong things happen, because you can get something that looks good, but that's a very transitory state, and the long-term damage that's done as a result of that can sometimes be an order of magnitude harder to fix than the original problem. So it's that balance of have some output measures, but have some input measures as well, and make sure that you're looking to operate on the change rather than operate on the measures.
Yeah, absolutely. Spot on.
Oh, well, it's absolutely great to talk to you, Alison. Thank you very much. We will add into the show notes some links so people can find out a bit more about you, and some other resources as well. Thank you very much for your time and a fascinating conversation.
It's an absolute pleasure. Lovely to speak to you, Benjamin.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Work Together, a podcast brought to you by SocialOptic. If you aren't already subscribed, search for SocialOptic Work Together on your favourite podcast service. And if you found it helpful, don't forget to help others find the podcast by giving it a rating, leaving a review, and telling others about the show. You can find more from SocialOptic on our website, socialoptic.com. If your organisation would benefit from data-driven decision-making and desire to work better together, then get in touch through the chat box on our website. Drop us an email or give us a call. We'd love to hear from you. You can also read more on our blog, where we explore more of the themes we discuss on the podcasts. This podcast was hosted by Benjamin Ellis and produced by me, Chris Trim.